watching Charter Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and we are in the Inland Empire today. We are joined by Jason Huskey. He's a captain with the Riverside Sheriff's Department, the county sheriff's department. He is the commander over the coroner's bureau. I admit I'm kind of interested in what you do. It's a little macabre, but I admit it. Give us a sense of the responsibilities of your office, the Coroner's Bureau.
Sure, and thank you for having me, Brad.
Absolutely.
The Coroner's Bureau is responsible for handling all deaths in Riverside County. That includes all communities, including incorporated and unincorporated areas.
Okay.
For example, last year we had 13,000 deaths reported, which come to an average about 35 death reports that we have a day.
And these are deaths of all kinds, natural causes, suspicious, all types of deaths.
Yeah, all deaths are reportable to the Coroner's Bureau, but generally speaking, it's easier to provide the list of deaths that aren't reportable, and those would be deaths that occur as an inpatient in a hospital under the care of a doctor that's willing to sign a death certificate or provide a cause of death. Virtually all other deaths are reportable to the Coroner's Bureau.
And so you are not processing 13,000 who have moved on?
No, we received over 13,000 death notifications, and there's a portion of those that we actually do respond to and conduct scene investigation.
And let's talk about those. If the person did not pass as a result of, let's say, natural causes or in a hospital where the doctor can vouch, what happens?
Well, we get the phone call and we have deputy coroners, and obviously we're a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week operation. We have deputy coroners that are stationed in the east end of the county in Indio and in Paris. And they receive the call either from a hospital, from a next of kin, or from law enforcement related to a death. They make the determination of whether or not there's a scene investigation necessary, and that would include things that you would expect, like suspected homicides, suicides, drownings, miscellaneous accidents, including traffic accidents, occupational deaths, and emergency room deaths as well.
How, if it's not immediately clear, how do you determine the identity of a body, let's say? What's the first thing you do?
In most cases that are reported, we have next of kin or someone reporting the death that's familiar with the decedent. In cases where bodies are found and there's no one present to identify it for us, we use identification that's found on the body. We also have the
wallets. They may have their driver's license.
Sure. Yeah. Other identifying materials that they might have on their person, and then we also have the opportunity to use their fingerprints to identify them.
And so there may be in the database. You could use DNA, presumably, if they're in the database?
Yes. If we can't identify decedents through fingerprints, then our next step would be DNA.
So let's, for example, if someone does not have a criminal record, would you have their fingerprint on file through, I don't know, passports, driver's licenses? Is my fingerprint on file?
Well, if you've ever been fingerprinted, or what's called live scan now, which is the electric version of fingerprinting, then your fingerprints are in the database
somewhere.
So people sometimes find that they have to give their fingerprints for certain jobs to apply for jobs. So that's a requirement of job applications. So
let's talk about what happens when you can't figure out who is before you. And in Riverside County, we know since 1895, 141 individuals have been found deceased and unidentified. And I must give a shout out to the Desert Sun, because they did a series that was just outstanding. It was published in August of 2015. I read it recently, and it was so incredibly compelling about how they went through some of the cases that are still outstanding. 141 people have died, and we don't know who they are. Talk to us about that process.
Well, as you mentioned, there's about 141 cases that we have dating back to 1895, where we haven't been able to identify. Some of those are very small remains. It could be just a bone in some of those cases. And in a lot of those cases that date back that far, there isn't really any identifying features, and we consider those cases very difficult to solve. We have another list of about 55 cases where we have remains, we have fingerprints, we have DNA. The body was in a condition, and oftentimes in a condition where we have photographs, and we still have been unable to identify those decedents.
And so what's the process that you go through to try to uncover the identity of these individuals once you've kind of exhausted what you just described?
Well, in cases where we have DNA and we're able to collect DNA, we send it to a database. The California Department of Justice maintains a database. So it'd match it with any family members, for example, that may have reported somebody missing. Oftentimes law enforcement will collect the DNA from families that report family members over long-term missing periods. And in those instances, there have been identifications made from family members who have provided their DNA to the state.
I remember actually recently someone was identified that was a victim of Charles Manson. This was in Los Angeles County. And as a result, I mean, this case has got over 40 years old. I guess they got a DNA hit in the end. I think that's what happened. And then it's got to be incredibly frustrating. There was a discussion of an individual in this article named Henry Lee Lucas who confessed to a whole series of murders, including murders in Riverside County, and it wound up his confessions were not valid.
Yeah, I understand that in the 1980s he had confessed to several crimes, two of which I believe were Riverside County cases. They were originally closed and then later reopened because it was determined that he had fabricated those confessions. Are
there any facts that seem to string these cases together? You know, look, here in Riverside County, there's a lot of open space. It's not a particularly urban county. You have urban centers, obviously. Does that present additional challenges?
Oh, sure. A lot of some of the remains that we find are in desolate areas out in the middle of the desert, and of course, when they're exposed to elements like that, sometimes the remains are such that all we have maybe is DNA at best. We don't have fingerprints. We don't have photographs, so it's difficult even to create a sketch of what the person might have looked like.
The article talked about one case that was solved, and it must have been quite gratifying for your department. Raina Chesman was a 55-year-old transgender woman who was missing. And ultimately, I guess, a body had been found, but the body had been manipulated in such a way the head was not attached, et cetera. But then 10 or 12 years later, the head was found, and that created the ability to identify this individual.
Yes, and what happens when you have two different remains in two different jurisdictions, that's an example of where the DNA database really is beneficial, because it was the DNA database that once the head was found, the DNA was submitted and was matched to the earlier found torso. And
so they knew who it was.
That's right.
And that must have been, at some level, a sense of closure was provided to the family and friends.
I'm sure. Not every time we look at these cases, we know that there's somebody out there searching for these people that are wondering where their loved ones are.
My guess is that you have a sense of pride with regard to an organization that was started actually out of Riverside County called Garden of Angels.
Yes.
Tell us about Garden of Angels.
Well, I understand that there was an incident that occurred a couple decades ago where a child was thrown out of a car.
That's right.
The Garden of Angels was started to bury children that have been unidentified.
Right.
And over the past couple decades, I can't remember the number, but there's a large number, a cemetery in San Bernardino County where this lady has taken all the unidentified remains of children and buried them, given them names, and given them tombstones.
You're absolutely right. I mean, she is one of IE's finest. Her name, I want to say it, Miss Debbie Ferris.
Debbie Ferris.
And she, like you said, has set up a plot in a certain area of the Inland Empire to bury these unknown children or unidentified children. She gives them names. But as a result of her efforts, she also was able to have a safe surrender law passed. Tell us what safe surrender is. Slightly out of your purview, but I know you know what it is.
Safe surrender allows anyone who has an infant, they are able to drop it off at a fire station or at a hospital without any legal recourse. The way that the legislation is written, it allows people to drop these infants off in a safe environment as opposed to discarding them somewhere else. And no questions would be asked.
I guess the cliche is no blame. I mean, just if you do it within 3 days, that's it. No prosecution. We thank you. We move on. Over 650, I understand, have been dropped off. Thank you for explaining to us what the work of your office does, and we appreciate you joining us. And please give our best to the Sheriff Stan Sniff. He is Jason Huskey. He is the commander of the Coroner's Bureau in Riverside County Sheriff's Office. I'm Brad Pomerance, Charter Local Edition.